So good morning, everyone. We are going to start our meeting. Sorry, I request everyone to mute their mics so that we can start. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. On behalf of the IEA, we are pleased to welcome you to our 29th webinar. We are very glad that you are able to join us for our discussion today. The IEA is a public policy think tank. We are based in Nairobi, and our mission is to inform decision-making in Kenya by use of research, policy, and dialogues to generate evidence, which we then share with policymakers for evidence-based policymaking. So the IEA, we work across 5 program areas, and our main work is around public finance management, economic regulation and competition policy, trade, international trade and development, futures and strategic foresight, and our final program, which is on constitution, law, and the economy. Today we'll be hosting our 29th webinar. I'm sure some of you have had the opportunity to join us for most of our other discussions. And as you saw in the notice, the invitation notice, the title of today's meeting is Economic Resilience. African economies must build back after the pandemic. In terms of a quick background, a few months after the declaration of the COVID-19 as a pandemic by the WHO, the IEA, in partnership with the Observer Research Foundation in India, partnered to review Africa's response to the COVID crisis. What we did was to conduct an analysis of the political, economic, and some of the technological vulnerabilities that affected Africa's response to the crisis. And this was documented in a report, which I'm sure some of you may have had an opportunity to look at. The report was titled The Day After Tomorrow, Africa's Battle with the COVID-19 and the Road Ahead. About a month or so ago, we had our first discussion on one of the chapters in the report, which basically mapped the political risks that had an effect on Africa's response to the pandemic. So today we'll be discussing the second chapter in the report, which was some of the chapters were prepared by our teams, our research teams here at the IEA, and others by our colleagues at the Observer Research Foundation. And so today we'll be discussing the second chapter that was prepared by our team at IEA, which is basically on economic resilience and the need for African economies to build back stronger after the pandemic. If just to provide again another brief background to this chapter is that with the emergence and the spread of the COVID-19, we saw governments across the globe attempting to contain the COVID-19 pandemic in various measures, and some of the containment measures have resulted in global economic shock. Economists and experts across the globe have made various projections that it will take a long time for economies to recover. And this is not only peculiar in Africa, but also globally. However, for our situation here in Africa, the effects have been a little more adverse given where we were even prior to the pandemic. So, depending on where economies were before the pandemic in terms of their development and industrialization, some will have a little more work to do than others in terms of rebuilding. And again, as I've stated, our continent has been hardest hit, given that we house the largest percentage of the world's poor, as well as the majority of most fragile states. Looking at the Fragile States Index, the majority of those states are in Africa. So we clearly have a little more to do in terms of rebuilding and actually getting to where we had projected to be prior to the pandemic. So today we'll be looking at economic resilience. How do we build back better, having bearing in mind the various shocks that we have faced as a response of, due to the COVID crisis. Our discussion will seek to answer a few questions. And the first of this is, what are some of the fundamental requirements for building economic resilience across the African continent? I'm sure my colleague will highlight what some of those factors are, what has largely affected how our economic projections for growth look like, and what are some of the requirements for building economic resilience, specifically for African states. Then secondly, what structural transformation might we require to prevent or minimize the effects of a similar crisis in future? So most of us had not anticipated to live through a pandemic in our lifetime, but having gone through this, it is we cannot rule out the possibility of having another one in the next in the future. So having learned from this, what are some of the measures we need to put in place in order to minimize any adverse effects on our economies, specifically the African context, going forward? So to help us shed some light to some of these questions and basically provide us an analysis of this chapter, we have two of my colleagues who prepared this chapter on economic resilience. Actually, it was prepared by three of my colleagues, Maureen, Anna Grace Kemunto, as well as Kwame Owino. Today we'll have two of my colleagues, Anna and Maureen, presenting this chapter to us. But before I invite them to speak, I'll request that all of us, just for purposes of housekeeping, kindly keep your mics muted to allow them a smooth environment to make the presentation. Mute your mics as well as turn off your video apart from the speakers. In the event that you'd like to turn any of this back on, you'll have the opportunity to do this during the plenary. But also, as we go on, I will request you to note down any questions that you may have on the presentation, and then we can ask this during the plenary. We have a facility on this Teams platform where you can, a chat box where you can note down some of your questions as we go, and our speakers will try and respond to them either on that same platform or during the plenary. So without any further ado, I will invite my colleagues to take us through their findings and this presentation. So, as I've mentioned, we have Anna Grace Kemunto and Maureen Barasa. They are both research officers at the IEA, and they undertook this study together with Kwame. So, Anna, I invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you, Jackie, for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll take you through the first section and the second, and then Maureen will lead us from there on. So beginning on structural transformation and the state. So African economies, as we all know, are heavily reliant on the exports of agricultural produce and minerals. So this gives us a very under-diversified economy. And with the closure of economies, or rather the suspension of cross-border trade, African economies were hard hit because they could not send out their produce as well as receive imports too. This low diversification stretches out into low diversified employment, low diversified incomes, and low diversified exports. And the agricultural sector in particular is likely to draw in more labor, what I like to call some undisguised unemployment, because now we know Africa has 80% of the labor in the informal sector, which leaves only 20% working for the formal sector. And with the slowdown of manufacturing industries and service industries like the tourism sector, there's going to be a shift in the demand for certain types of labor. So now there's retrenchment in some industries, and these people are likely to fall back to agriculture. And this type of agriculture is smallholder farming, and it's mostly subsistence. So as you can see, I remember some time back in Kenya, we had an influx of roadside farmers. You remember people selling agricultural produce by the roads on Kiambu, with their boots stacked with fruits and vegetables. And this is some form of unemployment, because these people are not working where they used to work, probably in the more highly productive sectors like manufacturing and the service industries, and are now leaning onto agriculture. What we project this to show in future is that there will be some form of agriculture will have a larger pie in the GDP, not because of higher production, but because of a shrinkage in the manufacturing and other service industries. And the structural change here is now that, like in Kenya, we had 30% of our GDP attributed to agricultural produce, employing about 70% of the labor force. Now more people are moving into this 70%, which is going to make it even larger, and this is not good. So we advise that the structural change should be slowed down or delayed, because it's going to have adverse effects if people are now leaning on to only one sector, which is the agricultural sector. We also see in the graph provided below that unemployment almost doubled in the year 2020 with the onset of coronavirus. Between the first and second quarter of this year, there has been almost 1.7 million jobs lost. And looking at Kenya, which produces about 1 million jobs a year, we've lost almost double that in the difference of one quarter. And this highlights the need for prevention of mass unemployment. Something must be done to push people towards the high productive sectors and keep them there. That's one way in which our continent as a whole can move towards a better structural change. Also, I think it was yesterday we had a webinar where someone mentioned that in Nigeria, they buy tea from the UK, and that tea is Kenyan tea. They wouldn't buy it directly from Kenya. So this means that Kenyans export our tea to the UK, and then the Nigerians buy it from them. And why do we need to do this? If we can have more integrated continental trade, this would diversify our economies and we'd build each other better and quicker. Yeah. So the next section was on social security frameworks decoupled from formal employment. The title alone is highlighting that most social security frameworks within Africa are linked to formal employment, such that where you work is where you peg your retirement benefit or whatever social health insurance and all that from your place of work. And drawing back to the statistic of 80% of Africa's labor force in the informal sector, this shows that only 20% have that surety of social protection. And adding on to the loss of incomes in Africa by virtue of coronavirus being a supply and demand problem in the sense that people were not able to go to work as before because of the travel restrictions and the form of lockdowns, quote unquote, and a demand side problem because of the reduced purchasing power due to loss of incomes and high unemployment rates. So as I mentioned, we have a huge proportion of Africa's labor force in the informal sector. And unfortunately for our social safety nets, they highly attention most informal poor. These are people who get like Kenya's cash transfer for the orphan and vulnerable children, for the old, the people suffering with HIV and AIDS. And on the extreme end, we have the formal who have jobs, and under these jobs they're offered social protection like the NSSF or other forms of retirement benefits. Now this leaves a huge gap in between these two polars, where we have the informal non-poor who are also vulnerable and the informal non-poor who are non-vulnerable, all of whom need social protection. And this is a gap. As highlighted in the figure, it's the missing middle in social protection. So what do we advise? We see already countries like South Africa, even prior to the pandemic, had around 30% of their population receiving social protection in terms of monthly cash transfers prior to the pandemic. And this is quite commendable for an African country. But we also have other countries like Togo, which had to introduce new forms of cash transfers through mobile money transactions on the onset of the pandemic. And this is dangerous because now, had the pandemic not occurred, who knows whether this mobile transactions, digital mobile cash transfers would have been implemented. Aside from cash transfers, we have other governments like Botswana, which have also looked to food distribution schemes and wage subsidies together with price freezes on essential items as a form of social protection, which is important because people do not only need money to maintain their livelihoods, but they need food. And this pandemic has also highlighted the need for healthcare services under social protection, because now you see people who didn't have a form of health insurance in governments where they were not incurring the cost of treating the COVID-19 would have to incur the cost themselves. So there is need for health insurance or health services under social protection. Moving forward, I think African governments should invest in creating and updating digital registries and investing in regionally interoperable IDs such as the Huduma number, which I believe would have been used as a basis of identifying the most vulnerable people in the community who would be benefiting from what Kenya had as the 2,000 shillings cash transfers to the vulnerable during the coronavirus pandemic. I hand it over to my colleague, Maureen.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm going to take you through the Green Imperative. Under the Green Imperative, we're going to look at the need for green investment for a resilient future. The Green Imperative involves government's investment in the green economy, the green energy and fuel as a whole. Under this, we have a diagram that explains the gains and gains and progress made by the continent towards the green economy. Our chart shows the electricity access rates in select sub-Saharan African countries and South Africa. The chart explains that prior to the pandemic, we see that African economies had made good progress in electricity access rates. We can see countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. In majority of the households, they had electricity access before the pandemic. And as my colleague has mentioned before, there's the issue of job loss. Like for instance, in Kenya, we've lost 1.7 million jobs in the second quarter. And given the effect of the job loss in the economy, we tend to see that there will be a reversal in the progress that has been made in the years before in electricity access across households. We also tend to see decrease in green economy options among African households. Before the pandemic, when the households had income, they could afford efficient forms of cooking fuel, maybe they'll have to go back in the green economy option, where they'll have to use maybe cheaper option of cooking fuel due to loss of income. I'll use an example of Kenya, where we have data from the Economic Survey 2020. We can see from the charts, the majority of the households in Kenya, like about 66.7%, use firewood as a form of cooking fuel. Then the second largest group used gas, then paraffin, and the rest used other forms of cooking fuel such as electricity, ethanol, and biogas. This is seen as an improvement from cooking fuels used in 2015. According to the Economic Survey 2015, about 80% of the Kenyan households use firewood and charcoal as a form of cooking fuel. Given that this loss of income across the households due to loss of jobs, there'll be an increase in demand for less efficient forms of fuel. We also tend to see that governments have been unable to incorporate green imperatives in their budgets. For instance, when you look at the Kenyan budgets for the financial year 2020-2021, we see that the energy sector budget allocation was almost half of what was invested in the year 2015. We also see that there will be a delayed implementation of policies and investments that had been set aside by governments before the COVID pandemic. For instance, in Kenya, we had the National Energy Policy. South Africa had the carbon tax in 2019, and in Nigeria, they had the flare gas prevention in 2018. There'll be a delay in the implementation since funds that had been set aside to implement the policies and to make sure the investments have been completed will be directed towards response for the COVID-19 emergency. Governments have been reducing investments, and at the same time, we see them raising taxes. What does this mean? The taxes, for instance, I'll give an example of Kenya. In the recent finance bill, we had a 14% VAT for plastic, biodigesters, biogas-related equipment, and lifting of biogas equipment. We also had a 15% VAT on companies that operate recycling plants and 14% tax on LPG, solar equipment, and accessories, and also cooking stoves that were produced locally and those that were imported. This means it's a counterproductive measure since before these items had tax exemption. This means that this will affect the supply and demand incentives for the green economy, since most people won't be able to afford the green energy. Since they'll become more expensive for them, and the providers for the green economy won't also be able to supply to the market, since the demand will also be less. I'll also take you through the human capital that deals with education and training for a resilient future. In this chapter, we are looking at some of the measures by majority of the governments, such as school closure as a measure of combating COVID-19. At the onset of COVID-19, we all saw that majority of the governments, such as Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, the government gave directives for school closure, and a country like South Africa, they also closed school and opened when the cases decreased, but then closed when there was an influx in the number of cases. This led to online learning that has been mostly done online through online tools such as television, radios, internet, and printed materials. For instance, in Kenya, parents have been sent materials to print, maybe homework for their kids to study at home. And I'll give an example of the Ugandan government. The Ugandan government announced through the Office of the President that it will distribute radios and wireless system to educate kids at home and at the same time give them information related to COVID-19. Then we also look at a comparison of African governments' budget allocation to education. In this case, we looked at two governments. We looked at a comparison between the Kenyan government and the Ugandan government's budget allocation towards education. And you tend to see that the Kenyan government increased its budget allocation towards education, which was 26.7% of the total spending, while the Ugandan government had 8% of the total spending. There's also allocation of funds towards recruitment of more staff so that they can recoup the time lost during school closure. For instance, the Kenyan government allocated 2 billion to employ 5,000 intern teachers, 800 million for digital learning and CBC, and in addition to that, they added 300 million for ICT interns. From this, we realize that African governments must invest in children engagement in schools, building digital literacy, and ensure skills transfer. In this chart, it's an explanation of the education budget as a percentage of the total budget. In 2019, in the financial year 2019-2020, we see that for the case of Kenya, we see that there's an increase in education budget allocation from 2019-2020 to 2021-2020. From 2019-2020 to the financial year 2020-2021. For the case of Uganda, it was a decrease from the financial year 2019-2020 to the financial year 2020-2021. And they cited the issue of decrease in donor funding. Next, we look at thinking about data sustainability and supply chain resilience. Under data sustainability, we have a chart to explain the debt sustainability that explains the estimated remaining debt service for 2020 by region. And our main focus is Africa, so we look at the sub-Saharan Africa. We do realize that due to the pandemic, countries have not only been suffering depressed growth, but they also risk defaults on debts as a result of reduction in exports and depleted foreign reserves. It's been projected that the GDP of Africa will decrease for the first time in 30 years. And looking at our at the pictorial representation from the OECD, we can see that apart from East Asia and Pacific, the Sub-Saharan Africa had a higher percentage of debt service as a percentage of the GDP. The debt burden is higher when the debt burden is higher than the GDP, it creates a burden. The finance ministers for the G20 countries recognize the risk debt defaults in low-income countries like Africa, and therefore they offer the option of debt relief through debt postponement until 2021. We are aware that when the debt burden is higher than the GDP, the repayments might be severely damaged. And they linked the debt burdens to the economic fragility in Africa. So that's why they postponed the debt burden until the end of 2021. But then again, we have some countries like Kenya and Ghana who have debt services from private lenders. Okay, for instance, China, who have not offered any feedback on debt repayment or debt obligations, and this might cause an economic turbulence on Africa. The next thing we look at is the supply chain resilience. And under the supply chain resilience, when at the onset of COVID, domestic and international travel restrictions limited, as a measure of combating COVID, to limit social interactions. They caused a disruption in regional and global supply chains. There was grounding of life, among other things, among cessation of movement, for instance, in Kenya, as the president issued the directive. Under this, it's significant, and where we could see that countries were unable to procure important commodities for medical service delivery. When you look at this case in Africa, most of the African countries depend on India for drugs, and they also depend on China for medical equipment, the PPEs. And during the beginning of COVID in Africa, there was more demand than supply for the PPEs, and this caused the prices to be high due to the demand. So this prompted the domestic manufacturing and relying on domestic value chains. For instance, in Kenya, we started producing masks as Kikotech, and we also saw NYS and other individuals working to produce masks, among other things, to help in combating COVID. And under this, we also saw debates on import substitution and its sustainability debates reactivated as a growth and development policy. For instance, in Kenya, we've had this debate of Buy Kenya, Build Kenya, those shirts that have been paraded to promote local. Yeah, it's been termed as growth and development policy, whereby we feel like a country can be self-sufficient, producing locally, and consumption is being done locally, which is a bit hard according to economics. So I'll hand the next chapter to my colleague Anna.
Thank you, Maureen. Our final chapter is on strengthening the banking and financial system. Among the initial responses to coronavirus was from the banking sector, and they sought to restructure the digital payment ecosystem, reduce the central bank rate, and facilitate loan restructuring between the borrowers and the lenders. In terms of the changes in the digital payment ecosystem, we have the government of Kenya and Rwanda, for instance, which waived the charges on mobile transactions. Rwanda specifically making it free to transact cashless, and Kenya, where we had the wave in Kenya, where we had CBK waive the first any mobile money transactions of 1,000 shillings and below. This was reported to reflect an increase in the number of mobile money transactors, and also it was reported that about 80% of all mobile money transactions in Kenya were of the denomination 1,000 shillings and below. So we can see here that there's higher demand for smaller transactions than there is for higher transactions, and this actually did help keep the economy moving. Another advancement in the digital payment ecosystem was the increasing in the limits of mobile money transactions, where, if you remember, nowadays when you send money via M-Pesa, you get a notification of up to how much can you transact within the day. The limit was extended to 300,000 a day. Also, as mentioned earlier on the cash transfers, governments across the continent are actually pushing for digital payments, and they're doing it themselves by sending the government-to-person cash transfers via mobile money. Another advancement in strengthening the banking and financial system is the reduction of the central bank rates by about 150 basis points in Kenya and Rwanda, which have been done with the aim of increasing liquidity and making loans more available and affordable to the people. And we know that the small and medium-sized enterprises have been hard hit, and so this was done to make banking institutions be more willing to lend to the more risky borrowers instead of just relying on the government, which we call a credit crunch. There's also the allowance for restructuring of loans so that we don't have a high default rate that is projected due to the loss of incomes and the assumption that people will not be able to pay their loans and other debts in time because of this shock. And this allowance now gives people the opportunity to discuss with the lenders as to how long they're willing to spread the terms of the loans to accommodate them more. And also, we're seeing more donor funding from other governments to help cushion the effect on the banking and financial system, to keep money afloat in the economy and keep businesses going. And yes, as much as the pandemic has had its downturn on us, we see the light in this, that African states can now take advantage of this pandemic to deepen financial inclusion. A good example is Ghana, where the Ministry of Finance is now liaising with the Ghana Post to allow people to open mobile money accounts virtually. Here, the problem they're addressing is the distance issue, where they're now bringing the bank to the people instead of people going all the way to the bank. You can open your bank accounts from where you are, and this will deepen financial inclusion such that we have more people with bank accounts. And it was noted actually in Ghana that mobile money accounts had a larger impact than any other account on influencing people to open other financial accounts. So we have more people opening mobile money accounts. It's assumed that there'll be more people opening bank accounts. Also, it presents an opportunity for banks to collect and analyze transaction data that will help them in improving their financial risk management policies moving forward, such that if ever there is to be a pandemic of this sort or of even greater magnitude, they would know how to prevent themselves from financial risk. In conclusion, we see that this pandemic has had its adverse effects on the whole world, and it won't be tamed until there's a robust global recovery. Therefore, it's a matter of self-interest for countries all over, beyond Africa and within Africa, as well as a humanitarian concern, for them to provide assistance to developing economies and emerging markets where needed. Because without this, we don't see this pandemic going. Instead, it will persist even longer and increase inequalities in our communities and global divergence. So we all need to come together, even as African countries, to build back better. Thank you so much. That was a presentation from myself, Anna Grace, and Maureen. We hand the session back to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Anna Grace and Maureen, for that very good presentation. I'll try and in a minute or so just try and recap before I invite your questions for plenary. So I mentioned at the beginning that their chapter in the presentation was going to seek to help us answer two questions. The first being on what are some of the fundamental requirements for building economic resilience and what African states might need to do to prevent or minimize the adverse effects of any likely future pandemic. And I think they've done a brilliant job at helping us understand some of those underlying factors and what states might need to do. So in their presentation, they started by discussing the structural transformation of the state, and Anna took us through how African states tend to be over-reliant on agriculture, in specific basic small-scale agriculture, and they mentioned the need for diversification if we are going to rebuild, build stronger economies in future. Second, she took us through social security frameworks. Their chapter talked about social security frameworks and decoupling this from employment. And here the main takeaway was that a robust social protection mechanism needs to go beyond limited cash transfers and cover health protection, and that there's need for urgent and renewed focus on just strengthening the system. Then third, they discussed the need for green investment for a resilient future, and Maureen took us through that, looking at our current reliance on different sources of energy and how going green might be more helpful and useful if we are to build more resilient economies here in Africa. Then she also talked about human capital, and here specifically the focus was on the place of education and training in building a resilient economy and population. Then they shared their thoughts on debt sustainability, how debt service has had an effect on economies during this pandemic and how we need to relook at that. Then they looked at supply chain resilience, talking about manufacturing, and they gave various examples on that. Then lastly, the main the last thing was on strengthening the banking and financial system, and we had some concluding remarks from Anna on looking at how the financial sector has implemented various mechanisms during this pandemic, and going forward, what we can take away or what we can learn from this in order to strengthen the system. So that's a quick wrap up of, rather summary of their presentation. And now I'd like to invite your questions. I don't know whether there's any on the chat box, but I'm opening it up now for plenary. If anyone has a question, you kindly raise your hand. You can see there's a hand feature on this. Raise your hand or unmute your mic, state your name, and then share your question. You can direct it to any of our presenters, and we'll try our best to answer them. So, anyone? Any thoughts, comments, additional thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Faith from NCBA. Kindly unmute your mic. You're welcome to ask your question.
Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
Okay. Sorry, it shows on my end that it's taking a while to unmute. But thank you all for that wonderful presentation. I think it provides some good insight into just how countries have managed the whole pandemic. My question will probably be, I don't remember who did exactly on the debt sustainability. We all understand that the pandemic has had some serious structural shocks to economic across the region, and we believe that this should reverberate through the economies for a while. Actually, from where we sit, we don't think the recovery will go back where we were this year or even next year. It's going to take a while to recover, and that means for government to even go back to the level of revenues they were anticipating would take a while, which feeds directly into the scope and how they manage debt. So, and critical to that is just how they renegotiate, especially the bilateral and multilateral debt with the G20, which have expressed flexibility to provide some moratorium. I was hoping you at least provide some color in whether any of the countries you looked at has successfully managed to somewhat renegotiate some part of the external debt, and if there's any clarity on the terms under which they are supposed to service that debt, just as a precursor or a benchmark to what maybe other countries may be subject to.
All right. Thanks, Faith. Thanks for that question. We've noted it. Let me pick another question. I'd like to do a complete round before I invite our speakers to respond. Anyone else with a question? Okay. As we wait for any other question, I think I'll invite I'll invite Anna and Maureen to respond to that. The question on debt sustainability. Has any country attempted and been successful at renegotiating the state of their external debt? What are your views on this? And we can also invite our other colleague to help answer this. So, Maureen, Anna, do you have what are your thoughts on this? Okay. Sorry, John. John.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Jackie and Maureen and Grace for the presentation. Now, in response to Faith's question, what I know is that G20 actually agreed to suspend debt repayment for a number of countries, and they were actually targeting the poorest countries. I think maybe they're around 75. These are basically the poorest countries, and Kenya is not actually part of them. I know that AU was actually negotiating and pushing for this debt repayment to encompass all the African, to be extended, actually, that suspension to be extended to all the African countries. I'm not sure of the details, but I think it was to be suspended. They were to suspend debt repayment for at least a year. But I know both from AU as well as UN, they were actually pushing for this to be extended to more countries, including countries like Kenya, countries in the lower middle income status, and actually they were also pushing for at least maybe two years or more. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay.
Faith, I see your mic is on.
No, it's all right. That's okay.
Any other question or additional comments, maybe reactions to the presentation? I don't see any question on the chat box. Does anyone have any other question, or the presentation was crystal clear?
Jackie?
Yes,
I'd
Anna.
just like to add on to what John said in response to Faith's question.
Yes,
they're
please.
posting a link on the chat box that would further elaborate exactly what John has mentioned. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So Faith, for your benefits and for anyone else, they are posting a link on if you look at the chat box, they'll be posting a link on further details in response to the question that Faith has raised and the response that John has given. So yeah, it's reflected there in the chat box now. Right. So before I conclude the meeting, I would like to give a final opportunity to anyone who may have a question or any other comment. No one, none.
Yes.
Who's? Oh yes, Emmanuel.
I had a question. This was a very interesting. Okay. Please, I'll just wait for permission.
Yes, please, Emmanuel. Kindly proceed.
Yes. This was an interesting presentation because of. I found it interesting. There was an emphasis on resilience, which is a contrast on possibilities for avenues to build resilience, which is a contrast from what we're used to hearing, which is the general degradation of economic affairs on the continent. So I wanted to ask the speakers what was most compelling resilient argument for them, and specifically what their hopes are in terms of economic integration of the continent, whether it will provide those alternatives for trade and whether it's a good avenue for resilience. Yes.
Okay. Anna, did you get Emmanuel's question? Anna Grace?
Sorry, Jackie, I didn't hear him clearly. Could you iterate?
Okay, Emmanuel, kindly repeat your question. She didn't get it. They didn't get it very clearly.
Okay, so I think what I was asking to be in a clear way is that how do you rank the possible avenues for resilience in terms of their viability? So which one would you say, okay, this is a very viable route to resilience? This is, and this is the least viable, but it's still a possibility.
Okay, I think, yes, I think that's clearer now. Anna, Maureen?
Thank you. I think let me go first.
Yes.
On the question of which one I think is most viable and would be seen into the indefinite future, foreseeable future, I think for all of these points we've talked about, as much as there is the negative side to them and the possibility of a slowdown in development in each sector, we can see that the African governments have actually taken initiative in each point, from structural transformation to social security to green imperative, the human capital, debt sustainability, and even the financial sector. They have taken a step, some forward, some backward. Like in the green imperative, I personally think we were moving steps ahead to move from around 80% to, is it 66% use in firewood, a reduction in the consumption of firewood, which is a less efficient form of fuel. That was a step ahead prior to the pandemic, but now they're actually disincentivizing people from using more efficient forms of fuel. And so if the governments at large could push forward with, policies that are not really directly related to the pandemic, this is an opportunity for them to even shoot higher and sharper. But now, if we all keep pegging on, this COVID, this corona, we wouldn't move ahead. But it's also an opportunity for the private sector to step up in form of upgrading their production. And we can see, like, even in the service industries, I remember watching the news some time back, and the Minister for Tourism was talking about how we need to be innovative. You know, we all thought Kenya was a pride of, tourism. We didn't really put much effort into capturing our local clientele, but now they are looking into the local tourists and how they can get them to visit, tourist destinations and hotels and all that. So my parting shot is that the green imperative here is what I feel needs to be put in more effort to move ahead, because we made one big stride forward and we're making several strides back. But otherwise, everything else, I think Africa is doing quite well for itself.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Anna. And maybe just to add to what she said, in Anna's view, the need for the green investment for a resilient future is key. Emmanuel, according to Anna, that's her main proposal. I would have besides that, and the fact that she stated that yes, there's need for consideration for all the factors they've mentioned. My view is that the first issue on structural transformation, looking at the need for economic diversification in order to ensure a robust recovery, I would think, in my view, that would be one of them. If we were to rank them, I would think that would be the most viable in future going forward. Economic diversification and how that would help us be able to respond in a more effective way to a crisis of a similar future. I would think the first point, Anna's views are the third point on the green investment. I don't know. I think it's just based on how, from what angle you're looking at the issues. But thanks. Does anyone else have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, Jackie, this is John.
Yes, John.
Yeah, I would like to jump in and add a few points. So in relation to Emmanuel's question, the way I would view it, of course, ranking is not necessarily very easy, but there are some quick wins. And this article and this work that Anna Grace and Maureen and Kwame shows is that in terms, it basically gives examples of some building blocks for sustainable economy. And what it shows is that there are some opportunities. For instance, on the issue of mobile banking and use of technology in the financial sector. So there is an opportunity there for increasing financial ownership and the like. There's also another opportunity that has arisen from supply chain breakdown in supply chain. This is actually on activation of local manufacturing sector, and this was actually mentioned by Anna Grace, and we already seen that, for instance, manufacturing of essential goods such as the PPEs and the like. So this is an opportunity for that, and there are already discussions about import substitution. On the flip side, there's some regression in the sense that we were making progress, for instance, in terms of reducing our deficit as a percentage of GDP. We were actually on a path for fiscal consolidation amidst the challenges that we've had in terms of accumulation of debt. But all these have had to be slowed down or suspended so as to provide money towards responding to the pandemic. So we see regression in that sense, as well as actually in the momentum towards the green economy. So there's also regression in that area. And this will probably take a bit of time for us to retrace our steps back to the path for fiscal consolidation and the like, and as well as for picking up on the momentum we had in green economy. Then on structural transformation, of course, this is actually a call for the need to ensure that we diversify our economy in terms of investing more in the manufacturing sector, providing incentive towards attracting foreign direct investment and stuff like that. So those are critical things that we'll have to do in the short to medium term, so as to enable us to build better and more sustainably going forward. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, John. So before I ask for closing comments final closing remarks from our two speakers, does anyone have anything else to add?
Jackie?
Yes, please,
I have something else to say. Yes. Okay, as much as the pandemic has caused backward movement for the African economies through close of maybe borders and trade has been slowed down, we might need tremendous political will to implement the policies that had been laid down before. And looking at maybe the internet that's been used in maybe studying, among other things, such as businesses, this gives us an opportunity maybe to move forward technologically as Africa and maybe move our platforms to be more technological than before. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, Maureen, for that addition. Anything else? Because I'm about to now close this and ask our speakers to give us their final remarks. Okay. I think in the absence of that, I'll just invite our speakers to give us their final closing remarks, just in a minute, a sentence or two, just anything that you may want to add before we close. Sorry, I'll start with you, Maureen. Do you have what's your final closing remarks?
Thank you, Jackie. Looking at this, we were dealing with how African economies are building back after the pandemic. As much as the pandemic has presented difficulties, we've seen difficulties maybe in our health system, we've seen difficulties maybe in our financial structures, our social security fund. It's presented an opportunity for us to do better, to make to restructure our financial system, maybe to work on the informal social fund, the social fund for the informal sector, to incorporate them, and for the green imperative, maybe to incentivize it by maybe working on the tax exemption instead of making us go backwards in terms of the green energy. Thank you, Anna.
All right, thanks, Maureen. Anna, your final thoughts?
I think this pandemic began as a health crisis, but we've seen it spread its roots to other sectors of our economies, like the financial sector, even impacting the environment. And we need not to lose focus of the fact that this is a pandemic, and I don't want to say it's here to stay, but it's not going tomorrow. So we have to work towards making stronger pillars in each and every sector through, I don't know, focused policies, good implementation, because, you know, we can have this policy set, but the implementation is slow. And most importantly, I'd like to see Africa come together as a continent in terms of trade and to build each other and to build each other better. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anna. I don't know if before I close, John, if you have any closing remark you might want to add?
None. I just wanted to note also the fact that this is based on the analysis. It's also a wake-up call for deepening intra-Africa trade, given the fact that we have shocks, these both demand and supply side shocks, but this also presents that opportunity to pursue Africa free continental trade agreement so as to deepen and or enhance trade amongst the African countries. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Jackie, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me just repeat. I was saying thanks for that. Thanks, Anna and Maureen, for your presentation today. I think it was very elaborate, and it has helped us understand African states' resilience and what we need to do going forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, IEA contributed to 3 chapters in this publication. The publication is available on our website. If you go to the resources section and look for a report titled "The Day After Tomorrow," you will find it. We've discussed the first 2 chapters, mapping political risks, and today looking at economic resilience. We are still going to organize one more forum like this, where we'll be looking at the chapter on an assessment of the economic responses that African states have taken to the COVID-19. Its responses, and it will be a bit different from what we had today in terms of resilience, because that will now actually be focusing on the responses that we've seen from states, different states across Africa. So kindly be gracious and available to when we invite you for another discussion, which will be happening soon on this. And on behalf of the IEA, first of all, I'd like to thank our speakers today, Maureen, Anna, for your presentation, taking your time to develop that chapter and put together a presentation and share it with us today. We appreciate that, and good job to the 2 of you. I'd also like to thank my colleague John, who's also contributed in this discussion, as well as all the participants who've attended the meeting and just contributed to the discussion. The IEA is a membership institution. If you are interested to be a member, kindly visit our website and look at, there's a tab on membership, and see how you can be able to join and be a more active participant in our work. You can also reach out to our communications team, and they'll be able to guide you on that. So that stated, I'd like now to close this discussion. Please look out for our future webinars, and we always put out our notices on our digital platforms, and we'll be glad to have you at another meeting here. So thank you so much, and we wish you a good afternoon and a good week. Thank you and goodbye.